Thanks for inviting me. As she said, I'm retired. I've been retired about 3 years, but I'm not really retired because I still have some grants and trying to finish some things up and still doing some writing and trying to close down the job. But retired means you're just not getting paid and you're working for free. So I don't really recommend it. Jason did a great job, and he's thought about this a lot more than me. But I've been writing for quite a while. I've written a little over 250 papers. About about three-quarters of them were accepted without much pain. About a quarter of them were accepted with a fair amount of pain, but eventually got accepted. And sometimes you have to go to several journals. And we haven't talked about picking journals. I'll get to that in a little bit. But just realize when you're writing, you have your first choice journal, and you hopefully get into that. But one of the questions is, how do you select your first journal that you want to submit your stuff to? And I'll talk about that a little bit later too. So I'm going to start off, you're going to find a lot of similarity between what I'm going to talk about and what Jason just talked about. He covered a lot of ground, and I'm going to cover some of the same ground. But I think it's good to hear it from more than one person, because we have different perspectives and objectives, et cetera, and experiences. And so the first thing I want to talk about, which Jason addressed, is creative writing versus scientific writing. Now, all the writing classes I took and all the English classes that I took were oriented towards creative writing, which I basically would call fiction. And fiction, whether it's a novel or a thriller or whatever, it's not based on full truth. This maybe have some truth in there somewhere. It's really based on capturing the minds of the people who are reading it and getting them excited and immersed in it and enjoying to read it. I don't think you can really say reading scientific papers is all that enjoyable most of the time, unless it's really outstanding and really something extremely new that just hits you from the side. And that only happens once every couple of years, at least for me. Scientific writing is a much more, I would say, disciplined thing. There's a lot of rules. There's, as Jason talked about, there's some room for creativity, but that's more creativity and presentation. There's a lot of guardrails and that you have to follow. There's guardrails that are set by the journal. Those are very particular guardrails, but there's guardrails set by ethics and guardrails set by sort of the norm, how things are done. From my point of view, the best way to start learning how to write scientific papers is to read scientific papers. And the more you read to start with, the better off you are. And read them in all kinds of journals. Read them in some of the top journals, Science and Nature and Cell, and some of the bottom journals. I'm not going to mention any names here because I might get kicked, but but you'll see a difference. And so do a lot of reading and be very critical in your reading, and also be a little bit emotional. How does it make you feel? There's some papers that you read and you actually feel kind of, well, that was a great use of my time. And there's some papers you read and you say, man, that sucked the life out of me. So, but start doing that long before you start writing yourself. So every day, when I was a graduate student, every day I tried to read at least 3 or 4 papers. Not always from beginning to end, some were skimmed, but at least to get through 3 or 4 papers, at least to get the information out of them, but also to start to get an understanding of the techniques and the style and sort of the norm of what a scientific paper looks like, because it's very different than creative writing. Now, I did the worst of all my subject areas in writing when I was an undergraduate, and didn't take any writing in graduate school, but we had to take a certain number of units of writing, and I was horrible. I really was. But it turned out that being bad at creative writing doesn't necessarily mean you're bad at scientific writing, because the standards and the techniques are so much different. And I've actually found I've had 57 or so graduate students in my career, some of which did both a master's and a PhD. And in my experience, oftentimes the best scientific writers are not from North America, and English is not their first language. They're the ones who they actually know and can speak some English, but they weren't trained in creative writing the way we train them in North America, which I think is a penalty. My own personal opinion is that, you know, if you're brought up like I was and taking all these creative writing things and you're supposed to be flowery and using really weird words and using different words that you wouldn't normally use in your normal speaking, that's a penalty. And most of my work with my North American graduate students is deprogramming them. Most of my work with my international students is programming them. It's a lot easier to program someone than deprogram them. Okay, that's part of my soapbox. I got more. And again, a lot of this is going to overlap what Jason said, but it's just my perspective on it. The first thing I say about writing a manuscript, you start with the data. Jason agrees. He and I agree on most of these things. Sifting through the data takes a lot of time. It's nice if the data is outstanding, because it's not an Easter egg hunt where you're spending all your time looking for a little nugget here or there. But to me, that's my favorite part of writing a manuscript. And in fact, for a lot of times, after I've sifted through the data and I didn't find many Easter eggs, it's hard to get yourself excited about writing that manuscript. But if you've sifted through the data and you find lots of Easter eggs, then writing that manuscript all of a sudden becomes fun. But still, it needs to be done. And then sometimes you gotta make an omelet out of cracked eggs, scrambled eggs. And so it has to be done. Then most often you're going to write more than one manuscript. So the next step is divvying up the data. And so you run these experiments sequentially. Oftentimes, you run this experiment, and it tells you that the next question is this. And then you run that, and the next question is that. But in my experience, that doesn't happen all that often. And people just run a series of experiments because that's how they decided to do it when they started doing their research. And they get this sequential series of answers that maybe are not very related. So when I say divvying up the data, that means, well, let's see, I've got enough data for 3 manuscripts, if you're a PhD student, maybe. Well, how do you divvy it up? Do you have to actually use the data in the order you collected it? Well, absolutely not. As Jason will say, you want to tell a story, or at least you want to put data into batches that provide continuity and allow you to make sense out of something that otherwise you couldn't. So that divvying up is just a matter of understanding all that data, getting into your head all at one time, and then respinning it so that it comes together in a series of orders that can get you 3 papers, and the best 3 papers that tell the most information. Now, AI is hitting the fan right now. Maybe AI can do that for you, I don't know, but it might be a good application for it. The second is deciding on style, and I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail. Deciding on style, and I think I'll get in that more detail. Be in the mood for writing. Jason addressed that, and we're pretty similar, except that I can't take the noise, Jason. That's for you. Order of the writing sections. I have a little different take on it just because my philosophy is a little different than Jason's, but he's at one end of my philosophy, and there's another end that I want to present. And then choosing words, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on because it's one of my favorite little peeves that I can needle students on. So writing a manuscript, I think of it as 2 different types. It's actually a continuum of types, starting with what I call the straight shooter and the storyteller. And the straight shooter does it kind of the by the book way. And that's typically what I have my master's students start with, is being a straight shooter. And then my PhD students become more of a storyteller. And my postdocs and myself, I become kind of a story spinner. So it's at different degrees of development, I think. But I typically try and push my master's students, it's the first time I've ever written a paper, more towards the straight shooter side of things. And so let me just describe what I'm talking about here. For a straight shooter, they do things like by the book. You talk about the problem in your introduction, the background, and then you make a hypothesis of what you predict will allow the field to move forward or the next missing piece. So you're starting with a hypothesis. That's where we were taught in high school. Then you write the results and discussion, and then you discuss the data. And in general, I think Jason's already covered this, but I discuss things based upon my various experiments that I ran. So this is kind of the order of things I do things in the discussion. I ran this first experiment that I'm presenting. It could have been my last experiment that I ran. But it agrees with my second experiment in these ways and disagrees with them in those ways. And I think the reason why there's some disagreement is because on the second experiment, it was 110 degrees in Davis in the middle of the summer. So you make a guess. And then you continue on with that, comparing. If you ran 3 experiments, you've got a bunch of different comparisons you can do and talk about the agreements and disagreements. And you're going to find, if you're being honest, there are a fair number of disagreements. You don't want to hide them under the rug. You want to get them out there, put them on the table, and address them. Materials and methods I'm not going to talk about. It's like Jason said quite accurately, it's like putting together a recipe for a dish. It's pretty straightforward. There's no bad way to do it, but there's no way to be especially creative in the materials and methods section. It's just, you just got to get it out there. And you got to get it out there in a way that the people can actually understand it and, most importantly, can repeat it. Because if they can't repeat it by reading your materials and methods, it shouldn't be published. And then the discussion, you discuss the data relative to, the next thing on the discussion is you discuss according to the results of others that have run similar experiments. And so, you get on top of the literature, you've already read everything that's been done, you've done all the lit searches, and you know that there's 7 or 8 other papers that have addressed the same problem, maybe in a slightly different way, came at it from a different angle, and they either got similar results or not. But you need to go through that exercise of making your data congruent with the rest of the literature, and where you can't get it congruent, you need to discuss why that is and why you think you might be right or why you might think they might be right. And then the last one is your hypothesis. You had a hypothesis. A hypothesis might be something like, I think Kirk Klasing is a bad writer. And so you ran experiments with Kirk Klasing, you sat him down, had him write different things, and turned out your hypothesis is correct. And so you discuss that, because for the following reasons, Kirk Klasing is a bad writer because he did this thing bad and that thing bad and the other thing bad. My hypothesis is correct. He's a loser. Next thing you do is summarize all your results and their significance. And that's just looking at the big picture, because you're kind of going through looking at the bunch of little pictures. Experiment 1 versus experiment 2, my results versus their results. And now you try and make it much more global. And then especially talk about their significance and discuss why this is important, and maybe, given its importance, what we might do next or what someone else should do next. Now, that's the straight shooter. For the storyteller, most everything's the same, but I'm going to point out a few things that are different. First of all, there's no hypothesis. You state the problem, which is part of the story. You give the background, a short summary of the results and context that you've already figured out. So you're not starting with a hypothesis, you're starting with a conclusion. And you're adjusting your introduction so you look really smart, because it turns out your story is true. So you don't have a hypothesis, and so you don't mention one, but you provide all the elements, and then just sort of, this is what happened, and just real quickly the conclusion, and then you do the materials and methods, same, results same, discussion pretty much the same, but you get, during the discussion, you get back to the story and that you already have introduced in the introduction, and it's going to be very congruent with the way you discuss the material. And again, you summarize the results and their significance, and discuss how and why this is important. So again, this is a continuum. The straight shooter starts with a hypothesis, and they either shoot it down or prop it up. The storyteller starts with what the data told you, and then writes a congruent introduction that makes you look really smart because it gets you back to what the data actually shows. Now, I'm going to ask the faculty here who've been around for a while, do you guys do that? Or you just ask hypotheses? Yeah. It sounds like all but one or two. Storytell. I do both, actually, still. I storytell if it's a good story. If there's not much of a story there, I go back to the hypothesis. Okay. I have almost the same slide as Jason had. Be in the mood for writing. Time of day. I'm also a morning person. Especially when I had little kids, I would get up and get a couple hours work done before they started screaming. And then I had to go to work and do my day job. Location, I like it quiet and comfortable. I mean, not everybody has a private office like faculty do, but just find a place. As a grad student, I just wrote at home. My apartment, got up early. All my roommates slept till like 10 because they were drunk all night last night. And so I just get up and get the writing done then. Again, I don't like distractions. That's why I don't want to write in my office because someone's going to be banging on the door. Put your phone in airplane mode so you don't have dings going off all the time. Give yourself some peace. You got to concentrate. Writing requires a tremendous amount of concentration, and interruptions are going to kill you. And the other thing about writing is that it's really good to do it continuously. You can't stop writing and then try and pick it up a month later and get going again because you've lost your place. And it's going to take you forever just to get back to your mind back to where it was when you stopped writing. So just try and keep it going every day or every other day or whatever, but just don't have any big gaps. And also stretch your legs, get up every now and then. I can only write for maybe 2 hours without having to get up and kind of just sort of space out a little bit. Put on some stupid movie or something, watch it for 10 or 15 minutes and get back to writing. Or go out and do some push-ups or something. But something that gets your mind cooling down a little bit so you can get back into it. Okay, order of writing sections. We've been through this before. For the straight shooter, I usually recommend my new master's students start with the introduction because that makes sure they've done their literature review. It's amazing how many times beginning graduate students haven't bothered to start with their lit review. They just go out there and start running experiments. And you shouldn't start running experiments until you've done some lit review, or you should at least be doing your lit review while you're running your first experiment. And then materials and methods, results. I usually say do the materials and methods before the results because you can kind of do that while you're collecting your results. So you can get ahead of the game if you start with materials and methods and sort of write them up as you're doing it because it's fresh in your mind. And your results are going to be a little bit later because you got tissues to analyze or whatever. And then last is the discussion, so you put it all together. You look at your results and put it all together. But the storyteller, they start with materials and methods while they're running their experiments, and then they get the results, and then they take a good hard look at those results. Really look at it hard. Find out what's really important in this data. What's the most important nuggets? What's the second most important nugget? And then you start spinning your story, and that's writing the discussion. So you take those important nuggets and you discuss it in the ways that I talked about with the straight shooter. And then last, you write the introduction, because now you know what your story is after you've done your discussion, and then the introduction. And of course, last is the abstract. Don't bother with an abstract until your whole story has been discussed. Okay, I'm going to end up, the last thing I'm going to talk about is choosing words. Well, actually not the last thing, but second to last thing, choosing words. So again, this is partly part of the deprogramming that I have to do with North American natural English speakers who have been trained in fiction writing. First, use common words as much as possible. Don't get some obtuse word that only half the people understand and have ever used or know the definition of. You just use the most common word you can that the largest fraction of the population of scientists and even normal people would understand. You don't have to prove that you're smarter than everybody else because you can get a fancy word. But sometimes you need to use a little bit more fancy word because they better fit the meaning that you're trying to get across. But I start with the simplest word that gets that meaning, and if I can't use the simplest because it just falls a little bit short, you bring in the next more fancy word. But you don't start with the fanciest word that means the same thing as the most common word, because you're losing a bunch of people. And you're pissing them off because they have to go get out their dictionary. Oh, you don't have dictionaries anymore. They have to Google it and find out what it means. So don't bother them, because you know what's going to happen? They're going to quit reading your paper. Or if they're a reviewer, you just tick them off. So the next one is use words with the fewest possible meanings. There are lots of words that have 4 or 5 different meanings. They could be used this way or that way or the other way. And there's some words there's only one meaning. I could get vulgar here, but there's some 4-letter words that really they can only be understood one way. And there's other words, they're obtuse. You don't really, what exactly did he mean by that? Get one, just again, simple words with the simplest numbers of meanings. And of course, precise words. There's some words that are fuzzy. They can mean many things. A word like a couple. I had a couple of treatments. Well, that's not very precise. So start with the precise stuff. And then also, one of the things they always taught me in creative writing is that you always don't ever want to use the same word twice in the same paragraph, because that shows that you don't have much vocabulary. Well, that's wrong. Because of number 2 and number 3 and number 4, in other words, ordinary words, don't use fancy words, fewest possible meanings, and precision, you may have to use that word 9 times in the same paragraph, because any substitution is going to dilute the quality of what you're trying to convey. So throw that bragging that you got a really big vocabulary and you're going to use it whether you need it or not, throw that out the window. And be succinct. So you write a sentence, read that sentence several times, rewrite it, and see if you can get the same job done with a lot less words. And then to do it again once you've done it once. That's every single sentence you write. And then read the paragraph and do the same thing. Can I write this paragraph maybe with fewer sentences? Or if I design this paragraph with those sentences and do it in a different way, I can make it shorter. Because again, you want it to be easy to read and consumer friendly. And your consumer is the person who's out to get you, which is your competitors in the field and also the reviewers. So make it hard for them not to like you. Don't make it hard for them to get through this stuff. So concentrate on making sentences easy to read, precise, and succinct. And that's hard. It really is, especially when you do it to begin with. Keep the flowery stuff out. Anything that is not directly contributing to the ideas you're getting across, you want to get across, get rid of it. Okay. I had told our group in our first meeting that we had on our Zoom that I was going to wait and see what Jason said and react to it. So I got a few reactions. I had a hard time finding much wrong with it, I have to say. I'm embarrassed because I'm usually pretty good at that. But I'm just going to say a couple things I jotted down here that I wanted to bring up again and really more or less embellish it in ways that I think about it. Logical flow, that's really important. You should have, and it's with storytelling, you should have a logical flow. You're going through the funnel, the introduction, you're going through the data, you're going through the discussion, but it all has, so I'm going to add to the logical flow of ideas the idea of connectivity. So there has to be connectivity between your introduction and your results and your discussion. And things you brought up in your introduction should be in your discussion, and things that you discuss should be reviewed and made understandable in your introduction. And this is maybe something you do towards the end of the process when the paper you think is done, But you gotta have to go through it several times and check the box for each sentence in your introduction and your discussion to make sure there's connectivity. Problem solution narrative, which was one of the ways of designing papers. Again, I think that's sort of more the standard way we do things in science. I'd say when I write papers, that's generally the way I try and do it. It's not always a solution. It may just be a gap that we filled in that need to be filled in before we get to the next step. Tables and graphs. I hate tables. I don't like to make tables. But graphs I love. I mean, I love just, I'm on an airplane sitting there trying to fill in time. I just love getting on my graph pad program and making graphs and trying to think about how I can make a graph that can convey the most amount of information in the easiest way. And no one can really do that for you. You really have to do it yourself and then show it to people and see whether or not they understand it. Because a lot of times you think, well, if I set up the graph this way, you know, x-axis here, x and y-axis doing certain things, it's going to convey the information. Well, maybe there's better ways to do it. So piddle around with it and give it a lot of thought in it. And this is where reading other people's papers is really important, because you'll see the graphs that really convey information very accurately and easily. And depending upon how your experimental design was, the way you set those graphs up is going to be different. Jason recommended following guidelines of, you know, the journal. Well, first of all, anybody who knows me knows I don't follow too many rules. Never did. And I hate it. But you have to do it. I say do it last, because it's, at least in my mind, it's the most picky thing and least important thing. You're doing it just to satisfy the editors of the journals. So I say do it last. Now, Jason didn't like writing the discussions. That's actually my favorite part. My second favorite. My favorite part is looking at the data and figuring out what those nuggets that are really important. That's my favorite part. Actually, my problem is once I figure it out, I don't want to write the paper because all the excitement's gone. But the next most important, exciting thing to me is the discussion for me, because it brings it all together and it allows you to say what's really great about this research and that sort of stuff. I also want to say a little bit about falsifying data, because it's continually a problem and it's more of a problem. It continually becomes more of a problem. Maybe it isn't more of a problem, but we're better able to detect it. So if you're just making it up, it's pretty hard to detect, actually. But don't make up data. I think you all know that. But there's some subtle things like grooming data that you really shouldn't do either. You know, if you run an experiment with 5 treatments, and if you just showed the 4 treatments, it makes a better story than if you show all 5. You really shouldn't do that, because there's probably, first of all, it's just not, it's deceptive. And second of all, if the data is good, there's probably something in there that makes that 5th column really important, and you just don't see it. But someone else may see it, and then when they collect more data, they'll say, this is why that happened, and it's really helped me. And the last one is selective presentation. Well, that's sort of what I talked about. Selective, well, no, let me back up. Selective presentation I think of as not providing numbers that make things look bad. So I've caught students sometimes saying not determined in one spot where it was determined, but it really was bad. It screwed everything up, made the stats not significant, where if you threw that one out, it would be significant. So those are some of the problems, and you got to be honest with everybody, but mostly you have to be honest with yourself, because if you try those, it's a shortcut to fame, but it's not a shortcut to knowing the truth. And so with that, I'm going to wrap this up, and thank you for listening. And I'm really happy that this seminar got put together. Hopefully, what we're telling you will make you better writers, and that will make us more have better people that we can get as graduate students and employees, et cetera. So thanks.